Let me ask you to, again, steel man the case for and against Trump. So my biggest criticism for him is the fake elector scheme, the 2020 election, and actually the 2020 election in the way you formulated in the Nation of Victims. It's just the entirety of that process, instead of focusing on winning, doing a lot of whining. I like people that win, not whine, even when the refs are biased in whatever direction.
So look, I think the United States of America, I preach this to the left. I preach it to my kids. We got to accept it on our own side too. We're not going to save this country by being victims. We're going to save this country by being victorious. Okay. And I don't care whether it's left-wing victimhood, right-wing victimhood. I'm against victimhood culture. The number one factor that determines whether you achieve something in life is you. I believe that's not the only factor that matters. There's a lot of other factors that affect whether or not you succeed. Life is not fair. But I tell my kids the same thing. The number one factor that determines whether or not you succeed in achieving your goal is you. If I tell it to my kids and I preach it to the left, I'm going to preach that to our own side as well. Now, that being said, that's just a philosophy. Okay, that's a personal philosophy. You asked me to do something different, and I'm always a fan. One of the things that the standard I hope that people hold me to when they read this book as well is I try to do that in this book, is to give the best possible argument for the other side. You don't want to give some rinky-dink argument for the other side and knock it down. You want to give the best possible argument for the other side and then offer your own view, or else you don't understand your own. So you asked me, what's the strongest case against Donald Trump? Well, I ran for U.S. president against Donald Trump. So I'm going to give you what my perspective is. I think it's nothing of what you hear on MSNBC or from the left attacking him to be a threat to democracy. I think all of that's actually nonsense. I actually think it is, if you were making that case, and he has my full support, as you know, but if you were making that case, I think for many voters who are of the next generation, they're asking a question about how are you going to understand the position that I'm in as a member of a new generation. The same criticism they had of Biden, they could say, oh, well, are you too old? Are you from a different generation that's too far removed from my generation's concerns? And I think that that's in many ways a factor that was weighing on both Trump and Biden. But when they played the trick of swapping out Joe Biden, it left that issue much more on the table for Donald Trump. So you're asking me to steelman it? That's what I would say, is that when I look at what's the number one issue that I would need to persuade independent voters of to say that, no, this is still the right choices, even though the other side claims to offer a new generation of leadership, here's somebody who is, one of the older presidents we all have had who was elected. How do we convince those people to vote for him? That's what I would give you in that category.
Right. But I get it. And you share a lot of ideas with Donald Trump. So I get when you're running for president that you would say that kind of thing. But there's other criticism you could provide. And again, on the 2020 election.
Let me ask you, you spoke to Donald Trump recently. Mm-hmm. What's your top objection to potentially voting for Donald Trump? And let me see if I can address that.
The 2020 election, and not in the, TDS kind of objection. It's just, I don't think there's clear, definitive evidence that there was voter fraud.
Let me ask you about a different area.
Hold on a second. I think there's a lot of interesting topics about the influence of media, of tech, and so on. But I want a president that has a good, clear relationship with the truth and knows what truth is, what is true, and what is not true. And moreover, I want a person who doesn't play victim, like you said, who focuses on winning and winning big. And if they lose, like walk away with honor and win bigger next time, or like channel that into growth and winning in some other direction. So just like the strength of being able to give everything you got to win and walk away with honor if you lose. And everything that happened around 2020 election is just goes against that to me.
So I'll respond to that.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm not the candidate, but I'm going to give you my perspective nonetheless. I think we have seen some growth from Donald Trump over that first term and the experience of the 2020 election. And you hear a lot of that on the campaign trail. I heard a lot of that even in the conversation that he had with you. I think he is more ambitious for that second term than he was for that first term. So I thought that was the most interesting part of what you just said, is you're looking for somebody who has growth from their own experiences. Say what you will, I have seen, personally, I believe, some meaningful level of personal growth and ambition for what Donald Trump hopes to achieve for the country in the second term that he wasn't able to for one reason or another. COVID, you could put a lot of different things on it, but in that first term. Now, I think the facts of the backdrop of the 2020 election actually really do matter. I don't think you can isolate one particular aspect of criticizing the 2020 election without looking at it holistically. On the eve of the 2020 presidential election, we saw a systematic, bureaucratically and government-aided suppression of probably the single most important piece of information released on the eve of that election, the Hunter Biden laptop story, revealing potentially a compromised U.S. presidential candidate. His family was compromised by foreign interests, and it was suppressed as misinformation by every major tech company. The New York Post had its own Twitter account locked at that time. And we now know that many of the censorship decisions made in the year 2020 were actually made at behest of U.S. bureaucratic actors in the deep state, threatening those tech companies to do it, or else those tech companies would face consequence. I think it might be the most undemocratic thing that's happened in the history of our country, actually, is the way in which government actors who were never elected to the government used private sector actors to suppress information on the eve of an election that, based on polling afterwards, likely did influence the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. That was election interference of the highest order. So I think that that's just a hard fact that we have to contend with. And I think a lot of what you've heard in terms of complaints about the 2020 election, whatever those complaints have been, take place against the backdrop of large technology companies interfering in that election in a way that I think did have an impact on the outcome. I personally believe if the Hunter Biden laptop story had not been suppressed and censored, I think Donald Trump would have been unambiguous. I think the president of the United States right now would be Donald Trump. No doubt about it, in my mind. If you look at polling before and after and the impact that would have had on the independent voter. Now you look at, okay, let's talk about constructive solutions, because I care about moving the country forward. What is a constructive solution to this issue of concerns about election integrity? Here's one. Single-day voting on Election Day as a national holiday with paper ballots and government-issued voter ID to match the voter file. I favor that. We do it even in Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the United States. Why not do that everywhere in the United States? And I'll make a pledge. I'll do it right here, right? My pledge is, as a leader in our movement, I will do everything in my power to make sure we are done complaining about stolen elections if we get to that simple place of basic election security measures. I think they'd be unifying, too. Make Election Day a national holiday that unites us around our civic purpose one day. Single-day voting on Election Day as a national holiday with paper ballots and government-issued voter ID to match the voter file. Let's get there as a country, and you have my word. I will lead our movement in whatever way I can to make sure we are done complaining about stolen elections and fake ballots. And I think the fact that you see resistance to that proposal, which is otherwise very practical, very reasonable, nonpartisan proposal, I think the fact of that resistance actually provokes a lot of understandable skepticism. Understandable skepticism of, okay, what else is actually going on? If not that, what exactly is going on here?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of things you said. Probably disagree, but it's hard to disagree with the Hunter Biden laptop story, whether that would have changed the results
We can't
of the
know,
election.
obviously.
Right.
I looked at some post-election polling about the views that would have had, and I can't prove that to you, but that's my instinct. It's my opinion.
I think that's just one example, maybe a sexy example of a bias in the complex of the media. And there's bias in the other direction too, but probably there's bias. It's hard to characterize bias as one of the
Let me ask you one question about, because there's bias is one thing, bias in reporting. Censorship is another. So I would be open-minded to hearing an instance of, and if I did hear it, I would condemn it, of the government systematically ordering tech companies to suppress information that was favorable to Democrats, suppress that information to lift up Republicans. If there was an instance that we know of government bureaucrats that were ordering technology companies, covertly to silence information that voters otherwise would have had to advantage Republicans at the ballot box, to censor it, I would be against that. And I would condemn that with equal force as I do to the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story, suppression and censorship of the origin of COVID-19. All happened in 2020. These are hard facts. I'm not aware of one instance. If you are aware of one, I would let me know, because I would condemn it.
Most people in tech companies are privately, their political persuasion is on the left. And most journalists, majority of journalists are on the left. But to characterize the actual reporting and the impact of the reporting in the media and the impact of the censorship is difficult to do. But that's a real problem, just like we talked about a real problem in immigration.
But there's two different problems. I just want to sort them out, right? Because I have a problem with both. You talked about two issues, and I think both are important, but they're different issues. One is bias in reporting. One is censorship of information. So bias in reporting, I felt certainly the recent presidential debate moderated by ABC was biased in the way that it was conducted. But that's a different issue from saying that voters don't get access to information through any source. So this Hunter Biden laptop story, we now know that it contains evidence of foreign interference in potentially the Biden administration and their families' incentive structure. That story was systematically suppressed. So in the United States of America, if you wanted to find that on the internet, through any major social media platform or through even Google search, that story was suppressed or downplayed algorithmically, that you couldn't see it. Even on Twitter, if you tried to send it via direct message, that's the equivalent of email, right? Sending a peer-to-peer message. They blocked you from even being able to send that story using private messages. That, I think, is a different level of concern. That's not bias at that point. That's outright interference in whether or not, that's outright interference in the election. Let's do a thought experiment here. Let's suppose that Russia orchestrated that. What would the backlash be? Let's say the Russian government orchestrated the U.S. election. They interfered in it by saying that tech companies, they worked with them covertly to stop U.S. citizens from being able to see information on the eve of an election. There would be a mass uproar in this country if the Russian government orchestrated that. Well, if actors in the U.S. government bureaucracy or the U.S. technology industry bureaucracy orchestrated the same thing, then we can't apply a different standard to say that if Russia did it, it's really bad and interfered in our election. But if it happened right here in the United States of America, and by the way, they blamed Russia for it, falsely, on the Russian disinformation of the Hunter Biden laptop story, that was a false claim. We have to apply the same standard in both cases. And so the fact that if that were Russian interference, it would have been an outcry, but now it happened domestically and we just call that, hey, it's a little bit of bias ahead of an election. I don't think that that's a fair characterization of how important that event was.
Okay, so the connection of government to platform is this should not exist. The government, FBI, or anybody else should not be able to pressure platforms to censor information. Yes, we could talk about Paul Durov and the censorship there.
Sure.
There should not be any censorship, and should not be media bias. And you're right to complain if there is media bias, and we can lay it out in the open and try to fix that system. That said, the voter fraud thing, you can't right a wrong by doing another wrong. You can't just, if there's some shady stuff going on in the media and the censorship complex, you can't just make shit up. You can't do the fake elector scheme and then do a lot of shady, crappy behavior during January 6th and try to shortcut your way. Just because your friend is cheating a Monopoly when you're playing Monopoly, you can't cheat. You shouldn't cheat yourself. You should be honest and with honor and use your platform to help fix the system versus cheat your way.
So here's my view is, has any U.S. politician ever been perfect throughout the course of American history? No. But if you want to understand the essence of what was going around in 2020, the mindset of the country, we had a year where people in this country were systematically locked down, told to shut up, sit down, do as they're told, unless they're BLM or Antifa rioters, in which case it's perfectly fine for them to burn cities down. We were told that we're going to have an election, a free and fair election, and then they were denied information systematically heading into that election, which was really important and, in this case, damning information about one of the parties. And then you tell these people that they still have to continue to shut up and comply. That creates, I think, a real culture of deep frustration in the United States of America. And I think that the reaction to systematic censorship is never good. History teaches us that. It's not good in the United States. It's not good at other points in the history of the United States. The reaction to systematic, coordinated censorship and restraints on the freedom of a free people is never good. And if you want to really understand what happened, if one really wants to get to the bottom of it rather than, figuring out who to point fingers at, that really was the essence of the national malaise at the end of 2020, is it was a year of unjust policies, including COVID-19 lockdowns, systematic lies about it, lies about the election, that created a level of public frustration that I think was understandable. Now, the job of leaders is to how do you channel that in the most productive direction possible? And to your question, to the independent voter out there evaluating, as you are, do I think that Donald Trump has exhibited a lot of growth based on his experience in his first term and what he hopes to achieve in his second term? I think the answer is absolutely yes. And so even if you don't agree with everything that he's said or done in the choice ahead of us in this election, I still believe he's unambiguously the best choice to revive that sense of national pride and also prosperity in our country. So people aren't in the condition where they're suffering at behest of government policies that leave them angry and channel that anger in other unproductive ways. No, the best way to do it is actually actions do speak louder than words. Implement the policies that make people's lives better. And I do think that that's the next step of how we best save the country.
Are you worried if in this election, it's a close election and Donald Trump loses by a whisker, that there's chaos that's unleashed? And how do we minimize the chance of that?
I mean, I don't think that that's a concern to frame narrowly in the context of Donald Trump winning it or losing it by a whisker. I think this is a man who, in the last couple of months, in a span of 2 months, has faced 2 assassination attempts. And we're not talking about theoretical attempts. We're talking about like gunshots fired. That is history changing in the context of American history. We haven't seen that in a generation. And yet now that has become normalized in the U.S. So do I worry we're skating on thin ice as a country? I do. I do think it is a little bit strange to obsess over our concerns or national or media concerns over Donald Trump, when in fact he's the one on the receiving end of fire from assailants who reportedly are saying exactly the kinds of things about him that you hear from the Democratic machine. And I do think that it is irresponsible, at least, for the Democratic Party to make their core case against Donald Trump. It was Joe Biden's entire message for years that he's a threat to democracy and to the existence of America. Well, if you keep saying that about somebody against the backdrop conditions that we live in as a country, I don't think that's good for a nation. And so do I have concerns about the future of the country? Do I think we're skating on thin ice? Absolutely. And I think the best way around it is really through it. Through it in this election, win by a landslide. I think a unifying landslide could be the best thing that happens for this country, like Reagan delivered in 1980 and then again in 1984. And in a very practical note, a landslide minus some shenanigans is still going to be a victory. That, I think, is how we unite this country. And so I don't think, a 50.001 margin where cable news is declaring the winner 6 days after the election, I don't think that's going to be good for the country. I think a decisive victory that unites the country, turns the page on a lot of the challenges of the last 4 years and says, okay, this is where we're going. This is who we are and what we stand for. This is a revival of our national identity and revive national pride in the United States, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican. That, I think, is achievable in this election, too. And that's what the outcome I'm rooting for.
So just to pile on, since we're steel manning the criticism against Trump, is the rhetoric. I wish there was less of, although at times it is so ridiculous, it is entertaining, the I hate Taylor Swift type of tweets or truths or whatever. I don't think that's...
He's a funny guy. I mean, the reality is different people have different attributes. One of the attributes for Donald Trump is he's one of the funnier presidents we've had in a long time. That might not be everybody's cup of tea. Maybe different people don't want... That's not a quality they value in their president. I think at a moment where you're also able to make, I will say this much, is everybody's got different styles. Donald Trump's style is different from mine. But I do think that if we're able to use levity in a moment of national division, in some ways, I think right now is probably a role where really good stand-up comedians could probably do a big service to the country if they're able to laugh at everybody 360 degrees. So they can go up there and make fun of Donald Trump all they want, do it in a lighthearted and manner that loves the country, do the same thing to Kamala Harris with an equal standard. I think that's actually good for the country. But, I think I'm more interested, Lex, as you know, in discussing the future direction of the country, my own views. I was a presidential candidate who ran against Donald Trump, by the way, and is supporting him now. But I just prefer engaging on the substance of what I think each candidate's going to achieve for the country rather than picking on really the personal attributes of either one, right? I'm not criticizing Kamala Harris's manner of laugh or whatever, one might criticize as like a personal attribute of hers that you may hear elsewhere. And I just think our country's better off if we have a focus on both the policies, but also who's going to be more likely to revive the country. That, I think, is a healthy debate headed to an election. I think everybody has their personality attributes, their flaws, what makes them funny and lovable to some people makes them irritating to others. I think that matters less heading into an election.
I love that you do that. I love that you focus on policy and can speak for hours on policy.